Arabella Dashwood had not meant to spy on her father that cold March evening in 1851, but the half-open door of his study at Dashwood Hall drew her attention as she passed through the dim corridor, and what she saw through that narrow gap would lodge itself in her memory like a splinter beneath skin, small but impossible to ignore. The study was illuminated only by 2 oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the faded wallpaper, their light barely reaching the corners of a room that had once been grand but now showed the subtle signs of a family in decline. And there sat Sebastian Wentworth, the man they called the Iron Duke of Manchester, for the steel empire he had built from nothing. His dark eyes fixed on the documents before him with an intensity that made Arabella press her hand to her mouth to stifle the gasp rising in her throat. Across from him, her father, Lord Edmund Dashwood, counted banknotes with fingers that trembled slightly, not from age or infirmity but from barely suppressed greed, and even from her hidden vantage point, Arabella could see the denomination, could calculate the staggering sum that was changing hands. £50,000, an astronomical fortune, enough to save a dozen estates like theirs from ruin. Mr. Wentworth signed page after page with mechanical precision, his jaw clenched so tightly that Arabella could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and though each stroke of his pen seemed to pain him, his hand never wavered, never hesitated, moving across the documents with the same ruthless efficiency that had supposedly built his industrial empire. Her father spoke then, his voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction that Arabella had learned to dread, the sound of a predator who has cornered his prey. £50,000, he said, his words precise despite the brandy she could smell from the doorway. You understand this buys you nothing but my silence and cooperation, Wentworth. The girl knows nothing, and it must remain so. Arabella felt ice slide down her spine at those words, confusion washing over her in waves because what girl, what silence, what cooperation could possibly be worth such a sum? Mr. Wentworth's response came in a voice like gravel, rough and low. I understand the terms perfectly, Dashwood. You will have your money. I will have what I came for. The cold calculation in those words, the businesslike precision, made Arabella's stomach turn because this was clearly a transaction. Another of her father's endless schemes, perhaps some industrial partnership or investment opportunity that required discretion, though why it should involve a girl she could not fathom. She withdrew before either man could discover her presence, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself against the corridor wall, the ancient floorboards mercifully silent beneath her feet as she made her way back toward the main part of the house. The rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury, as if the weather itself reflected the darkness of what she had witnessed, and Dashwood Hall felt colder than ever, the rooms they could no longer afford to heat properly seeming to close in around her. Dinner that evening was held in the cavernous dining room, a space meant for 12 or more, now occupied by only 3 figures dwarfed by its proportions, and Arabella sat across from her younger sister Lydia, who chattered innocently about the novel she was reading, completely unaware of the storm gathering around them. Their father entered late, his face flushed with what Arabella recognized as triumph barely concealed beneath a veneer of paternal authority, and he took his seat at the head of the table with the air of a man about to make a pronouncement. The servants brought the first course, fewer than there had been 6 months ago, another sign of their declining fortunes, and Arabella forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Her father waited until the servants had withdrawn before speaking, and when he did, his words fell like stones into still water. You will marry Sir Thomas Morland on April 15th, he said, addressing Arabella as if discussing the weather. The arrangements are made. Your opinion is neither requested nor relevant. The colour drained from Arabella's face so quickly that she felt dizzy, her fork clattering against her plate as her hand went nerveless, and she stared at her father in disbelief because Sir Thomas Morland was 40 years her senior, a man whose reputation for cruelty toward his previous 2 wives was whispered about in every drawing-room in the county. Father, please. she managed, her voice quiet but desperate. "Sir Thomas is 40 years my senior, and his reputation." She could not finish the sentence, could not give voice to the terrible things she had heard, but her father's expression hardened into something cruel and satisfied. "His reputation," he said, cutting her off with the precision of a blade, "is that of a wealthy man who has agreed to overlook our financial difficulties. You will comply, or Lydia's debut will never happen. In fact, I can ensure no respectable family ever receives her. Do you understand me, daughter?" The threat hung in the air between them, sharp and unmistakable, and Arabella's gaze flew to Lydia, who had gone very still, her blue eyes wide with dawning comprehension. Her sister was only 16, innocent and sweet, with her whole life ahead of her, and Arabella knew with sudden, terrible clarity that their father would absolutely destroy Lydia's prospects out of spite if she refused. She felt the trap close around her like iron bars, felt her future narrow to a single dark path, and she forced herself to nod, to accept this fate, because what choice did she have when Lydia's happiness, Lydia's entire future, hung in the balance? The rest of the meal passed in silence. The only sounds, the clink of silverware against china, and the rain that continued to batter the windows, and Arabella's mind kept returning to the scene she had witnessed in her father's study, to Sebastian Wentworth signing away £50,000 for something her father called silence and cooperation. She wondered if this marriage to Sir Thomas was somehow connected to that transaction, if her father had needed that money to facilitate this arrangement, though the timing seemed wrong and the details did not quite align. Mr. Wentworth was an industrialist, wealthy beyond measure, but common-born, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing to build a steel empire that employed thousands. And what could he possibly want from her father beyond perhaps some business advantage or aristocratic connection? That night, alone in her cold bedroom with its faded curtains and threadbare carpet, Arabella stood at the window looking out over the grounds of Dashwood Hall, at the gardens that had once been beautiful, but were now neglected for lack of funds to maintain them, and she felt the weight of her cage settling more firmly around her. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks before she would become Lady Morland, wife to a man known for his cruelty, bound to a future that stretched before her like a prison sentence. She thought again of Mr. Wentworth, of the cold intensity in his dark eyes as he signed document after document, of the way each signature had seemed to pain him even as his hand moved with unwavering precision. There had been something in his expression, something she could not quite name, that had looked almost like determination or perhaps desperation, as if he were committing to something terrible but necessary. Her father's words echoed in her memory. The girl knows nothing, and it must remain so. What girl? What secret? What silence was worth £50,000? Arabella pressed her forehead against the cold glass and felt tears sting her eyes, though she refused to let them fall because crying would accomplish nothing, and she had learned years ago that her father fed on weakness the way other men fed on bread. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the night clear and cold, the stars visible beyond her window, like distant points of light in an infinite darkness, and she wondered if somewhere out there was a life she might have lived, a future where she was more than a pawn in her father's schemes, more than property to be bartered for the settlement of debts. But that life was not hers, and never would be. And in 3 weeks she would walk down the aisle of the village church and bind herself to Sir Thomas Morland, would submit to whatever cruelties he devised, would slowly be broken the way his previous wives had been broken, all so that Lydia might have her chance at happiness. It was a sacrifice Arabella would make willingly, had to make willingly, because protecting her sister was the only power she had left in a world where every other choice had been stripped away. She did not know then, standing at that window in the darkness, that the transaction she had witnessed in her father's study was not what she imagined, that £50,000 had not been payment for business silence, but for something far more significant, that Sebastian Wentworth had not been conducting trade negotiations, but purchasing the very thing Arabella thought lost forever, and that the cold intensity in his eyes had been not greed, but determination to save a woman he had never met from a fate he knew too well. 3 days before she was meant to walk down the aisle and bind herself to Sir Thomas Morland, Arabella received a summons to her father's study, the same room where she had witnessed that mysterious transaction weeks ago, and she climbed the stairs with resigned dread settling in her stomach like lead because she assumed this would be another lecture on wifely obedience, on the duties she would owe her new husband, on the necessity of submission and silence. The afternoon sun streamed through the unwashed windows with unexpected brightness, the rain that had plagued them for weeks finally giving way to pale March sunshine that illuminated every shabby detail of Dashwood Hall's decline, the faded curtains and worn carpet stark in the unforgiving light. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, having learned long ago that her father viewed such courtesies as weakness, and what she found inside the study made her stop short in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Sebastian Wentworth stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the light, and even in profile she recognized the cold intensity she had seen when he signed those documents, the same mechanical precision in the way he held himself perfectly still. Her father sat behind his desk, but there was something wrong in his posture, something she had never seen before in all her 24 years. Lord Edmund Dashwood was purple with rage, his fists clenched on the desktop so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, but beneath the anger was something else, something that looked almost like fear, and Arabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet because her father had never been afraid of anything in his life. Mr. Wentworth turned as she entered, his dark eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze because she would not cower, not anymore, not when she had only 3 days of freedom left before becoming Sir Thomas's property. Sebastian spoke first, his voice carrying that same gravelly quality she remembered, but now directed at her rather than her father. Sir Thomas Morland will not be marrying your daughter, Dashwood. I have insured it. Now we discuss your debts, all of them, which I now hold. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that Arabella could not yet comprehend, and she gripped the back of the nearest chair for support, her knuckles going white against the dark wood. Her father sputtered, actually sputtered, his face deepening to an alarming shade of crimson. "You have no right," he said, his voice strangled with impotent fury. "This is extortion. This is—" But Sebastian cut him off with the precision of a blade, his tone cold and businesslike, though his hands remained clasped behind his back in a way that suggested he was hiding something, some tremor or weakness he did not want observed. "I have every right," he said. "Creditors may sell debts as they choose, and I have chosen to purchase yours. You have 2 options, Dashwood: debtor's prison and complete social ruin, or you consent to my marriage to Miss Dashwood. The settlement will clear your name but place you on an allowance controlled by my solicitors. You will live comfortably, but you will no longer gamble away your family's future." Arabella felt the room tilt, felt confusion war with a spark of hope that she immediately tried to suppress because hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and she had learned to expect nothing but cruelty from the men who controlled her fate. Marriage to Sebastian Wentworth, the man who had paid her father £50,000 for something she still did not understand. She searched his face for answers, trying to comprehend what game he was playing, what he could possibly want from her, and all she found was intensity, that same cold determination she had witnessed through the crack in the door. But there was something else, too, something in the set of his jaw that suggested this businesslike delivery cost him more than he wanted to reveal. Her father was speaking again, his voice rising with each word. "You cannot simply," he began. But Arabella found her own voice then, shaking with anger and confusion and the terrible realization that she was being bartered again, traded like property from one man to another. "I am not a commodity to be traded between men like a shipment of grain," she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "Does my consent mean nothing? Does my choice count for nothing at all?" Sebastian turned to face her fully then, and for 3 heartbeats they simply looked at each other. And something cracked in his facade, some flash of vulnerability that appeared and disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. When he spoke, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly, the cold, businesslike tone giving way to something warmer, something almost gentle. "Your consent means everything, Miss Dashwood," he said, "which is why I am asking for it now. Marry me, and you will never be bartered again. Refuse, and I will still destroy your father's hold over you, though the method will be less tidy." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and incomprehensible, and Arabella felt tears prick at her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing everything she did not understand. "Why would you do this? What could you possibly gain from rescuing someone you do not even know?" Sebastian held her gaze, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer honestly, might explain the mystery that had plagued her since that night she witnessed the transaction. "Because some cages must be broken," he said finally, "even if the bird fears the open sky." It was not an explanation, not really, but there was something in the way he said it, some depth of feeling beneath the careful words, that suggested personal experience with cages and freedom and fear. Her father slammed his fist on the desk, making Arabella jump despite herself. "This is absurd," Lord Dashwood said. "You cannot simply waltz in here and dictate terms. I will fight this. I will." But Sebastian's expression hardened again, the flash of vulnerability disappearing behind cold calculation. "You will do nothing of the sort," he said. "I hold debts totaling nearly £80,000. The original £50,000 I paid you, plus the additional gambling debts I have purchased from your creditors over the past 3 weeks, plus Sir Thomas's vowels, which I called due this morning, bankrupting him quite thoroughly. You have no leverage, no options, no power here. The only question is whether you consent to this marriage, or whether you prefer to explain to your peers why you are being carted off to debtor's prison." Arabella watched her father's face cycle through rage, disbelief, calculation, and finally, terrifyingly, defeat. And she realized with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration that she was witnessing something she had never seen before in her entire life. Her father, powerless. Lord Edmund Dashwood, who had controlled every aspect of her existence for 24 years, rendered completely impotent by a man who had simply outmaneuvered him with money and strategy. The electricity in the air was almost palpable, the sense of power shifting from one set of hands to another, and the room felt smaller somehow with Sebastian's presence, his industrial might at odds with the faded aristocratic gentility of Dashwood Hall's decline. Sebastian turned back to Arabella, and this time when he looked at her there was something almost apologetic in his expression, as if he regretted the necessity of this intervention even as he executed it with ruthless precision. "I know this is not the proposal you might have imagined," he said, his voice quiet enough that her father had to strain to hear. "I know you have no reason to trust me, no reason to believe my intentions are anything but mercenary, but I swear to you, Miss Dashwood, that if you agree to this marriage, you will have freedoms you have never known. You will have your own income, your own decisions, your own life. I am not asking you to trade one cage for another. I am offering you the key." Arabella felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from hope, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry or simply run from this room and never look back. She thought of Sir Thomas Morland, of the cruelty she had been resigned to endure, of the slow death of spirit that awaited her in that marriage. She thought of Lydia, still innocent at 16, whose future had hung in the balance of Arabella's compliance. She thought of the transaction she had witnessed, of £50,000 changing hands for silence and cooperation regarding a girl, and suddenly the pieces began to shift in her mind, not quite forming a complete picture, but suggesting the outline of something she had not understood. This man, this stranger, had paid her father an enormous sum and then systematically destroyed both Sir Thomas's finances and her father's leverage. All for what purpose? He claimed it was to free her, to break her cage, but men did not spend fortunes on altruism, did they? There had to be something else, some motive she could not see. And yet when she looked into Sebastian Wentworth's dark eyes, she saw not calculation or greed, but something desperate and almost pleading, as if her answer mattered more than anything in the world. Her father was speaking again, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Arabella, you will refuse this ridiculous proposal," he commanded. "You will tell this upstart tradesman that." But Arabella cut him off, finding a strength she had not known she possessed. "No," she said simply, and the word fell into the room like a thunderclap. Her father's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and she turned away from him to face Sebastian fully. "You said I have a choice," she continued, her voice steadier now. "You said my consent means everything. So I will consent, but I have conditions. I want your word, Mr. Wentworth, that Lydia will be protected, that she will have a proper debut, proper prospects, a proper chance at happiness. And I want your word that if I find this arrangement unbearable, if I discover that you have merely traded me from one tyrant to another, I will have the means to leave." Sebastian's expression shifted into something that might have been relief or respect, or perhaps both. "You have my word on both counts," he said. "Your sister will be provided for as if she were my own. And you will have independent means settled upon you that cannot be touched by anyone, including me. If you find me unbearable, Miss Dashwood, you may leave with enough funds to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Her father made a strangled sound, but neither of them looked at him, and Arabella felt the strangest sensation, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice with the choice to either fall back into the familiar darkness or leap forward into the unknown. "Then I consent," she said finally, and watched something like wonder flash across Sebastian Wentworth's face before he mastered it. "And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Arabella agreed to the marriage in her father's study, the words leaving her mouth before she could second-guess the leap she was taking. But afterward, alone in her room with her heart hammering against her ribs, she demanded one concession from Sebastian Wentworth before she would walk down any aisle. She wanted a week to become acquainted with the man she was binding herself to, a week to discover whether she had simply traded one prison for another, and to her surprise, Sebastian granted the request immediately, without hesitation or negotiation, as if he had been expecting it, or perhaps hoping for it. She assumed this week would be filled with awkward formalities, stilted conversations over tea in the drawing-room under her father's watchful eye, the kind of performative courtship that satisfied propriety without revealing anything true. Instead, Sebastian appeared at Dashwood Hall the next afternoon and suggested something entirely different. "I thought we might talk," he said, standing in the entrance hall with a leather-bound book tucked under his arm. "Simply talk. I find that most marriages fail because the parties are strangers who never remedy that condition. The library, perhaps, as neutral territory." Arabella had agreed, mostly from surprise, and found herself leading him to the dusty library that had once been her refuge before her father began selling off the valuable first editions to cover his gambling debts. The room still smelled of old paper and leather, still retained some nobility despite the gaps on the shelves where books had once stood, and weak March sunshine filtered through windows that nobody bothered to clean anymore. She sat primly in one of the wing-back chairs, hands folded in her lap, spine straight, every inch the proper lady her father had tried to mold her into, and Sebastian sat across from her, not touching the book he had brought, simply watching her with those dark, intense eyes until she felt compelled to speak. "You said we should talk," she said finally, her voice more defensive than she intended. "What would you like to discuss?" Sebastian had smiled then, just slightly, and said, "Whatever you like, Miss Dashwood. Tell me what interests you. What would you speak of if you could speak of anything at all?" And so she had, haltingly at first, testing the waters to see if he truly meant it or if this was some elaborate game, talking about the novels she had read, the poetry she loved, the botanical studies that fascinated her. He listened with genuine attention, asked questions that proved he was actually hearing her words, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, and when she mentioned Wordsworth, he quoted a passage from memory that made her look at him with new eyes. The first day passed more quickly than she expected, the light fading outside the windows until Sebastian glanced up in surprise and said he should leave before propriety was completely abandoned. The second day he arrived with a different book, this one a collection of essays on political economy, and they debated the merits of industrialization and its effects on the working classes. And Arabella found herself leaning forward in her chair, gesturing with her hands, completely forgetting to maintain the perfect posture her father demanded. Sebastian sat across from her, but his chair had somehow moved closer, though she could not remember seeing him shift it. And when she made a particularly sharp point about the responsibility of factory owners to their workers, he laughed, a rusty sound that suggested he did not do it often. By the third day, fresh flowers had appeared in a vase on the table between them, white roses that Sebastian claimed the room deserved, that beauty should not be neglected simply because a space was not used for entertaining. They talked about travel that afternoon, about places Arabella had only read about in books, and when she mentioned the Kew Gardens, mentioned the palm house she had seen illustrated in a magazine, her voice became animated in a way that surprised even herself. "You have travelled to the Kew Gardens?" she asked, unable to hide her eagerness. "I have only read about the palm house. Is it truly as magnificent as they say?" Sebastian's expression softened into something that might have been a smile, though it carried an edge of sadness. "More so," he said quietly. "But it would be better experienced than described. Perhaps we might visit together after—" He stopped himself abruptly, as if remembering something painful, and the sentence hung unfinished in the air between them. Arabella wanted to ask what he had remembered, what had caused that flash of pain across his features, but she sensed that pushing would only make him retreat behind the walls he was slowly lowering. The fourth day brought rain again, the kind of steady downpour that made the library feel even more like a refuge from the world, and they talked about his past, or at least the fragments he was willing to share. "Orphaned at 19, he told her, his voice matter-of-fact as if discussing someone else's history. "My father left me a small inheritance and a great deal of debt. I paid the debts and invested what remained in steel, worked 18-hour days for 5 years until the mill turned a profit, then built another and another. He never married," he said when she asked, "because industry demands total devotion, because building an empire from nothing requires sacrifices." But he would not elaborate on what those sacrifices had been, and when she asked why he had chosen her, why he had intervened in her engagement to Sir Thomas, he deflected the question with gentle humour that told her nothing while seeming to answer. By the 5th day, the library had become their space, separate from the rest of Dashwood Hall's oppressive atmosphere, and there were 2 cups of tea sitting on the table between them, long since gone cold because they had been talking for hours, and neither had noticed the passage of time. They were discussing Wordsworth's poetry, the relationship between nature and human emotion, And Arabella was arguing that the poet's later work lacked the radical fire of his youth when Sebastian quoted a line that made her laugh. Actually laugh. A genuine sound of delight that felt rusty from disuse, but real in a way that nothing had felt real for years. The sound startled them both. Sebastian went completely still, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an expression of such naked longing that Arabella felt her breath catch in her throat, felt heat rise to her cheeks, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with something dangerous and thrilling and terrifying. "I have not heard that sound in this house before," Sebastian said quietly, his voice rough. "Laughter. It suits you." Arabella tried to laugh again, but it came out shaky, nervous. "My father does not approve of levity," she said, falling back on the familiar excuse. Sebastian's expression hardened slightly, though not with anger directed at her. "Your father approves of very little that brings joy," he said. "That will change." And in that moment, looking at this man who had somehow become familiar over 5 afternoons of conversation, who valued her opinions and listened to her dreams and made her laugh for the first time in years, Arabella realized with alarm that she was beginning to care for him, that somewhere between political debates and poetry discussions, she had started to hope that perhaps this marriage might be something other than a cage with different bars. The realization terrified her, made her want to protect herself before she could be hurt, and she excused herself earlier than usual, claiming a headache that was not entirely false. That evening, unable to sleep, she wandered down toward the kitchens in search of warm milk and froze outside the door when she heard the servants gossiping inside. The voices carried clearly through the wooden panels. £50,000, one of the maids was saying, her tone both scandalized and delighted. "That is what they say he paid Lord Dashwood. For something. The county cannot stop speculating about what?" The cook responded with a knowing snort. "Obvious, is it not? A common industrialist buying his way into the aristocracy through marriage to a lady. No amount of money can purchase good breeding, but marrying it works just as well. The lot of them are doing it now. These factory men with more money than sense." Arabella pressed her back against the wall outside the kitchen, feeling her face crumble, feeling the fragile trust she had been building over 5 days shatter like glass. £50,000. The transaction she had witnessed in her father's study. Of course, that was what it had been. Sebastian Wentworth, common-born no matter how wealthy, purchasing his way into respectability through marriage to an impoverished aristocrat's daughter. She was not being rescued. She was being bought, just like her father had tried to sell her to Sir Thomas, except this buyer was younger and kinder and had the cleverness to court her first, to make her believe it was something other than a transaction. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, all the more painful because she had allowed herself to hope, had allowed herself to imagine that perhaps someone valued her for herself rather than what she represented. She did not sleep that night, lying awake in her cold bedroom as anger and hurt warred within her chest, and by the time weak morning light filtered through her windows, she had worked herself into a state of righteous fury. She dressed quickly and went directly to the morning room, where Sebastian had taken to arriving each afternoon, and found him already there despite the early hour, as if he had been waiting for her. The harsh morning light streaming through the windows showed everything with cruel clarity, leaving no shadows to hide in. And when Arabella spoke, her voice was shaking with hurt that she tried to disguise as anger. "They say you paid £50,000 for something," she said without preamble, watching his face. "For someone. Was it me? Did you purchase me like a broodmare to legitimize your industrial fortune with aristocratic blood?" Sebastian actually stepped backward as if her words had struck him physically, his hand rising as if to ward off the accusation, and the anguish in his expression would have moved her if she had not been so focused on protecting herself from further hurt. "Arabella, no," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded like pain. "You do not understand." "Then explain it," she demanded, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to remain strong. Explain why a wealthy man pays an astronomical sum to my father and then conveniently arranges to marry his daughter. Explain why you spent a week making me believe this might be something other than a business arrangement, when clearly I am just another acquisition for your empire. What am I to think when servants gossip about how you are buying your way into the aristocracy through marriage? What am I to think, Mr. Wentworth, except that you are no better than my father, just better at pretending otherwise? Despite the confrontation, despite Arabella's accusation, and the hurt that hung between them like a wall of glass, the wedding proceeded as planned because Sebastian insisted on honoring his agreement to free her from her father, regardless of whether she despised him for his methods. The ceremony was small, held at the Dashwood Chapel where generations of her family had been christened and married and mourned, and the space was filled with spring flowers that Sebastian had arranged, white roses and pale lilies that made the simple stone building feel almost magical in the weak sunshine filtering through stained glass windows. Arabella walked down the aisle in white silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and tears tracked down her cheeks that the handful of guests mistook for joy, but were actually grief for what might have been, for the connection she had felt growing in those library conversations before servants' gossip shattered her fragile trust. Sebastian stood at the altar with his shoulders rigid, watching her approach with an expression that held resignation rather than joy, as if he were certain he had lost her heart and was simply going through the motions of a bargain struck. And when she reached him and placed her trembling hand in his, she felt the faint shake in his fingers that he tried to hide. The vicar spoke the ancient words, the promises that would bind them for life, and Arabella repeated them in a voice barely above a whisper, while Sebastian's responses were steady and clear, as if he wanted there to be no doubt about his commitment, even if hers was given under duress. They signed the register, became husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law, and walked back down the aisle together, while the small gathering of guests applauded politely, mostly Sebastian's ancestral friends and a few of Arabella's distant relatives who had deigned to attend despite the scandal of her marrying so far beneath her station. The wedding breakfast was held in Dashwood Hall's dining room, but the space felt different now, warmer somehow, and Arabella realized with a start that there were more servants than there had been in months, that Sebastian must have hired back the staff her father had dismissed to save money. The table was laden with food, proper food rather than the sparse meals they had been subsisting on, and champagne flowed freely, though Arabella could barely taste hers, the bubbles flat on her tongue. She sat beside Sebastian at the head of the table, hyper-aware of his presence, of the way he would glance at her when he thought she was not looking, and she felt simultaneously trapped and strangely safe, as if she had locked herself in a cage of her own making. Lydia sat across from them, bubbling with excitement that seemed genuine despite the circumstances, and Arabella's 16-year-old sister had been chattering all morning about how handsome Sebastian looked, how kind he had been to her during his visits to Dashwood Hall, how he treated her as an intelligent person rather than a silly child, the way most adults did. When the time came for toasts, Lydia stood with her champagne glass raised high, her young face glowing with innocent joy, completely unaware of the tension that thrummed beneath the surface of the celebration. "To my new brother," she said, beaming at Sebastian with the unguarded affection of youth. "Mamma would have loved you, Sebastian. She always said Bella deserved someone who would value her mind as much as her beauty. And Bella, I am so happy you escaped, Sir Thomas. When I found Father's letter about Sebastian's offer to buy your freedom 3 months ago, tucked in the papers he had thrown in the fire but not quite burned through, I cried with relief. Thank you for saving my sister." The words fell into sudden, absolute silence. Arabella froze with her wineglass halfway to her lips, her eyes widening as understanding crashed over her like a wave, washing away all her assumptions and leaving something entirely different in their place. 3 months ago. The letter. Buy your freedom. The transaction she had witnessed in her father's study had not been about aristocratic connections or social climbing or any of the mercenary motives she had attributed to Sebastian. It had been about her. Specifically about saving her from Sir Thomas Morland. Someone's fork clattered against china, the sound impossibly loud in the shocked quiet, and Sebastian's face had drained of all colour, his knuckles white where he gripped his champagne glass. Lydia looked around the table in confusion, her smile faltering as she realized she had said something terribly wrong, though she clearly did not understand what. The remaining guests, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to make polite excuse and quiet exits until only family remained in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of celebration, abandoned champagne glasses, and wilting flowers, and the heavy weight of truth about to be revealed. Arabella set down her glass with exaggerated care, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she might shatter along with it. 3 months, she said, her voice barely controlled, each word precise and measured. You have been planning this for 3 months. The £50,000. Sebastian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and began to pace along the windows like a caged animal. Was to convince your father to delay the Morland wedding while I positioned myself to intervene permanently, he said, his voice rough. I could not, his words broke, audibly fractured on whatever emotion he was trying to contain. I could not let another woman be destroyed by a man like that. Arabella felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the pieces of the puzzle she had been trying to solve suddenly rearranging themselves into a picture she had not expected. Another woman, she repeated, the question implicit. Sebastian turned away from her, staring out the window at the gardens with his shoulders rigid. My sister Clara, he said, and his voice was thick with old grief, with pain that had clearly never fully healed. I was 23, newly wealthy, but still finding my footing in a world that did not want to acknowledge a factory owner's son as their equal. Our father arranged her marriage to a title, to a cruel man who drank and gambled and treated her like property he could break at will. She wrote me letters begging for help, and I tried. God knows I tried. But our father blocked me at every turn, told me I was being hysterical, that wives must submit to their husband's authority no matter how that authority was exercised. 6 months after her wedding, Clara threw herself from a 3rd-floor window. She was 19 years old. Arabella drew in a sharp breath, her hand rising to press against her mouth as if she could physically hold back the sound of her distress. Sebastian continued, still not looking at her, the words pouring out now as if a dam had broken. 3 months ago, I attended a dinner at Lord Morland's estate, a business matter regarding steel contracts, and I overheard him talking with your father in the smoking room after the ladies had withdrawn. They did not know I was there, lingering in the hallway, and Sir Thomas was describing in vile detail what he intended for his young bride, his rights as a husband, his plans to break your spirit the way he had broken his previous wives. He spoke of you as an object to be used and discarded, as property purchased for the breeding of heirs, and I was transported back to that moment of helplessness when I could not save Clara. But this time I had the means to act. I investigated your father's finances, discovered the crushing debts, the gambling losses that would ruin your family, and I made him an offer. £50,000 to delay the marriage to Sir Thomas, to give me time to buy up the other debts and gain the leverage I needed to intervene permanently. My plan was to free you and then walk away, to let you choose your own future without any obligation to me. But then I met you. He finally turned to face her, and his dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. And when I met you, when I spoke with you and saw your intelligence and your trapped spirit and the way you came alive when discussing ideas, I fell in love. I made the selfish choice to pursue you, to hope that you might choose me freely if given the chance. And I am sorry for the manipulation, for the control I exerted over your circumstances, for making you feel like property being traded when all I wanted was to give you the choice that Clara never had. Arabella sat very still, trembling fingers pressed to her mouth, and tears spilled over to track down her cheeks. But they were not tears of anger or betrayal anymore. They were tears of overwhelming emotion, of gratitude and shame for doubting him, and love that she had been trying so desperately to suppress. "You are sorry," she said finally, her voice trembling as she stood on shaking legs. "You saved me from a nightmare. You gave me choices I never had. You treated me as an equal when every other man in my life treated me as property. You spent a fortune to free someone you did not even know because you could not bear to see another woman destroyed the way your sister was destroyed. And you think I would despise you for that?" Sebastian was staring at her as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "You accused me of buying you, like a broodmare," he said carefully, "of being no better than your father, of purchasing my way into the aristocracy through marriage. I thought, when you looked at me with such hurt in your eyes, that I had lost any chance of your regard." Arabella crossed the space between them, her white silk skirts rustling, and reached up to cup his face in her hands the way she had wanted to do in the library before gossip shattered her courage. "I was afraid," she said simply. "I was falling in love with you, and it terrified me because I have only ever known men who wielded power as a weapon, who saw love as weakness to exploit. When I heard the servants talking about £50,000 and social climbing, it gave me an excuse to protect myself, to build walls before you could hurt me the way I have been hurt my entire life. But you were never trying to hurt me, were you? You were trying to save me." Sebastian's hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face, his eyes searching hers as if trying to determine if this was real or some cruel dream. "Everything I did was to give you choice," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even if that choice was to reject me, to walk away from this marriage with the independent means I settled on you, I would rather have you free and lost to me than trapped and miserable. I would rather you chose your own path, even if that path did not include me, than force you into a cage with different bars." Arabella felt something crack open in her chest, some final wall crumbling, and she smiled through her tears. "Then I choose you," she said. "I choose this marriage, this partnership, this life we might build together. Not because I have to, not because you manipulated me into it, but because in 5 afternoons of conversation you showed me what it feels like to be valued for my mind, to be heard and respected and treated as an equal. I choose you, Sebastian Wentworth, freely and without reservation. And if you meant what you said about loving me, then I need you to know that I love you too, that I have loved you since you quoted Wordsworth and debated political economy and made me laugh for the first time in years." Sebastian made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of fear finally released, of hope long denied, and when he kissed her it was with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Around them the dining room was empty now except for Lydia, who had tears streaming down her young face as she watched her sister finally find someone who would cherish rather than cage her, and the champagne glasses sat abandoned on the table alongside the wilting flowers, the remnants of a celebration that had become something far more profound than anyone anticipated. Later, when the emotion had settled into something quieter and more sustainable, Arabella asked Sebastian to tell her everything, and he did, holding nothing back as he described the investigation into her father's debts, the purchasing of Sir Thomas's vowels to bankrupt the old lecher, the careful manipulation that had seemed so cold and calculated, but was actually driven by desperation to save her from a fate he had been helpless to prevent for his own sister. He told her about Clara, about the letters she had written describing her husband's cruelties, about the funeral where their father had blamed her for being too willful, too difficult, when the truth was she had simply wanted to be treated as a human being rather than property. And Arabella told him about her own prison, about years of her father's tyranny, and the slow death of hope, about Lydia and the fierce protectiveness she felt for her sister, about the moment she overheard the servants gossiping and felt her fragile trust shatter because she had been so afraid to believe that someone might actually value her for herself. They talked until the sun set and the dining room grew dark around them, until servants discreetly lit lamps and withdrew again, giving the newlyweds the privacy they needed to rebuild what misunderstanding had almost destroyed. And when Sebastian finally took her hand and asked if she was ready to leave for London, for the townhouse that would be their first home together, Arabella said yes, with a certainty that surprised even herself. That evening, after the long carriage ride from Derbyshire to London, after the silent miles where Arabella had sat beside her new husband processing everything that had been revealed at the wedding breakfast, they arrived at Sebastian's townhouse in Belgravia, and Arabella stepped into a world entirely different from anything she had known. The house was stunning in its modernity, filled with light even in the fading hours of day, with comfortable furniture that seemed designed for actual use rather than display, and books everywhere, lining shelves and stacked on tables as if Sebastian surrounded himself with knowledge the way other men surrounded themselves with hunting trophies. The library he led her to was warm, a fire already crackling in the grate, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a small, private garden where early roses were beginning to bloom. It was the opposite of Dashwood Hall's oppressive cold, this space designed for life rather than appearance, and Arabella felt something in her chest loosen slightly as she took it all in. Sebastian poured them each a glass of wine and then sat across from her, maintaining a careful distance as if afraid to presume anything, and the oil lamps cast golden light that made the room feel intimate and safe. Arabella sat with her hands folded in her lap, but her fingers twisted together nervously, because there were things she needed to say, truths she needed to speak before this marriage went any further, and she was terrified of revealing too much, but more terrified of building a life on silence and assumption. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice quiet, but steady. "I have been a coward, letting fear poison what might have been beautiful. I love you, Sebastian. I think I have since you asked my opinion on Robert Owen's theories, as if my answer actually mattered, as if I was more than decorative, as if my mind was equal to yours. It was our third conversation in the Dashwood Library, and you spent an hour debating with me about the responsibility of factory owners to their workers, and you listened to my arguments and countered them with respect rather than dismissal, and something in me that had been dead for years suddenly came alive. I was terrified because love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant being hurt, because every man I had ever known wielded power as a weapon, and I was so afraid that you would do the same." Sebastian turned sharply from where he had been staring into the fire, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. "You love me," he repeated, his voice raw with emotion. "Even after everything I have done, the manipulation, the control I exerted over your father, the way I orchestrated your entire life without your knowledge or consent." Arabella stood, her white silk wedding dress rustling as she crossed the space between them, and she met his eyes with more courage than she knew she possessed. "You exerted control over my jailer, Sebastian," she said firmly. "You freed the prisoner. There is a rather significant difference. You did not manipulate me into loving you. You showed me what it felt like to be valued, to be heard, to be treated as a person rather than property. And I fell in love with who you are, not what you did." Sebastian looked at her as if he could not quite believe she was real, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her, but was restraining himself. "There is something I need to tell you as well," he said, his voice rough. "Something about what I want from this marriage, what I expect, what I—" He stopped, turned back to the fireplace, and delivered his next words while staring into the flames as if unable to watch her face in case he saw relief at the escape he was offering. "I want you to be free," he said, "truly free. I have opened accounts in your name with independent means that cannot be touched by anyone, including me. The marriage settlements my solicitors drew up guarantee you autonomy that most wives never have. If you want separate residences, I will arrange it. If you want to travel alone, I will support it. If you want, his voice roughened, breaking slightly on the words, if you want this marriage to be in name only, to remain unconsummated, I will honor that. I will not become another cage, Arabella. I would rather have you in my life as a free woman who chooses to stay than as a captive who must. Arabella felt tears spill over, but they were accompanied by laughter, a slightly hysterical sound of relief and joy because this man, this extraordinary man, was offering her freedom even within the bonds of marriage, was giving her choices even when he did not have to, was proving with every word that he meant what he had said about valuing her autonomy above his own desires. "What if I do not want freedom from you?" she asked, reaching up to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "What if I want freedom with you? What if I choose this, choose us, not because I must, but because I want to? What if I want a real marriage, Sebastian, partnership and passion and everything that comes with it, chosen freely rather than endured under duress?" Sebastian went very still under her touch, as if afraid that sudden movement would shatter the moment, and his dark eyes searched hers with desperate intensity. "You are certain?" he asked. "You are not simply saying what you think I want to hear. You truly choose this." Arabella smiled through her tears and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with more courage than she had known she possessed, and for a heartbeat, Sebastian remained frozen, completely still, and then his control broke, and he pulled her close with desperate tenderness, his hands shaking where they gripped her waist. The kiss deepened into something that had been building since their first real conversation, since that moment in the Dashwood library when she had realized he saw her as an intellectual equal, and when they finally broke apart to breathe, they were both trembling. "I have imagined this moment 1,000 times," Sebastian said breathlessly, his forehead resting against hers, "and convinced myself it would never come, that you would choose freedom over me, that I would spend the rest of my life loving you from a distance and pretending it was enough." Arabella smiled against his lips. "Then let us make up for lost imagination," she said, and kissed him again. And this time there was no hesitation, no holding back, just the two of them choosing each other freely and building something real from the ashes of what might have been a transaction, but had become so much more. They talked late into the night, curled together in the library with the fire burning low, speaking of dreams and fears and the future they might build together. And when Sebastian finally led her upstairs to the bedroom they would share, Arabella went willingly, joyfully, choosing every step of the way. The next morning, bright spring sunshine streamed through the breakfast room windows, making everything feel fresh and new and full of possibility. And Arabella sat across from her husband feeling more alive than she had in years. Sebastian was reading the Morning Post, sorting through invitations and business correspondence, when he froze with one letter in his hand, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Arabella asked, setting down her teacup. Sebastian passed her the letter without comment, and she recognized her father's aggressive scrawl immediately. The words were venomous, threatening, accusing Sebastian of being a jumped-up tradesman who purchased a lady's name to launder his common origins, claiming that he had bought his way into the gentry through a desperate marriage to a penniless aristocrat's daughter, promising to spread this narrative through every drawing room in London until Sebastian's reputation was destroyed. Arabella felt anger rise in her chest, hot and protective, and she looked up expecting to see Sebastian wounded or furious. Instead, he was smiling, actually smiling, and then he laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed entirely inappropriate given the vitriol in the letter. "How are you not furious?" she asked, bewildered. Sebastian reached across the table to take her hand. "Because his words have no power anymore," he said simply. "He lost that power when I took you beyond his reach. Let him sputter to anyone who will listen about social climbing and purchased titles. We will respond with action, not words." "What kind of action?" Arabella asked, intrigued despite herself. Sebastian's smile widened into something almost mischievous. "We host a ball," he said, "to introduce the new Mrs. Wentworth to London society. We invite everyone from my industrial world and the aristocratic ton, force them to mingle, to see that there is value in both worlds. Your father expects me to be ashamed of my origins, to hide my common birth and pretend to be something I am not. Instead, we will celebrate exactly who we are, what we have built together, and we will do it so publicly and so successfully that his poison will seem petty by comparison." Arabella felt excitement bubble up in her chest, the thrill of facing down her father not with submission, but with defiance. "He calls you a jumped-up tradesman who purchased a lady's name to launder his common origins," she said, reading the letter again. "The venom is almost impressive." Sebastian laughed again. "He is not entirely wrong about the tradesman part," he admitted, "though I object to jumped up. I prefer self-made. And I did marry a lady, though I would argue I married her for her mind and spirit, not her name. Still, if he wants to make this a matter of public speculation, we might as well give society something genuinely interesting to speculate about." Together, they composed a response, not to Lord Dashwood, but to London society itself, invitations to a ball that would be slightly scandalous in its mixing of classes, but undeniably intriguing in its promise of something new. Arabella wrote out the guest list in her elegant script while Sebastian dictated names from his industrial world, mill owners and engineers and inventors who had made their fortunes through work rather than inheritance, and she added names from the aristocratic families who had always been kind to her, who valued progress over tradition. They worked side by side at the breakfast table, the morning sunshine making her father's poisonous letter seem absurd and powerless, and Arabella realized that this was what partnership looked like, this collaboration and mutual support, this facing of challenges together rather than alone. When the invitations were ready to be sent, Sebastian pulled her into his lap, ignoring her laughing protests about propriety, and kissed her thoroughly. "Your father thinks he can destroy what we are building," he said against her lips. "He thinks his opinion still matters, that his approval is something we should seek. But he is wrong, Arabella. We do not need his blessing or society's approval. We have each other, and we have chosen this freely, and that is worth more than all the aristocratic pedigrees in England." Arabella cupped his face in her hands. This man who had saved her from a nightmare and given her choices and loved her enough to offer her freedom even within marriage. "Then let us show them exactly what we have chosen," she said. "Let us show them what it looks like when two people build something real together, when love is based on respect and partnership rather than possession and control. Let us show them, Sebastian, that cages can be broken and birds can fly, and sometimes the greatest freedom is choosing to stay with someone who would never dream of clipping your wings." And so they did. 6 weeks later, the Wentworth Ball was the talk of London, discussed in every drawing room and gentlemen's club from Mayfair to Westminster, because Sebastian and Arabella had deliberately crafted a guest list that forced the old aristocracy to mingle with Britain's new industrial elite in a way that was slightly scandalous, but undeniably intriguing. Mill owners would stand beside marquises, engineers beside earls, inventors beside viscounts, and the ton attended despite their reservations because curiosity outweighed snobbery, and because rumours of Mrs. Wentworth's beauty and Sebastian Wentworth's staggering wealth had reached fever pitch in the weeks since their wedding. The London townhouse had been transformed into a glittering ballroom, but deliberately less formal than traditional ton events, with more light streaming from chandeliers, more warmth from the fires burning in every grate, more life in the arrangements of spring flowers that filled every corner. Arabella stood beside her husband at the entrance to the ballroom, greeting guests as they arrived, and she was stunning in a gown of deep emerald silk that Sebastian had chosen because he said it matched her eyes. And she wore her confidence like a second skin, smiling with genuine warmth rather than the practiced politeness she had once performed. Those who remembered the timid Dashwood daughter, silent and cowed at society functions, stared in amazement at this woman who laughed easily and spoke her opinions without apology, and stood beside her industrialist husband with obvious pride rather than shame. Sebastian stood slightly behind her, letting her shine, and the pride in his expression was evident in every glance he directed her way, every subtle touch of his hand to the small of her back, every smile that softened his usually stern features. The evening progressed beautifully, aristocrats and industrialists mixing more easily than anyone had predicted, conversations flowing between classes in a way that suggested society might be changing, might be ready to acknowledge that worth came from character rather than birth, and Arabella felt triumph bubbling in her chest because they were actually succeeding, actually reshaping London society one conversation at a time. Then Lord Dashwood arrived, uninvited, clearly drunk, his cravat askew and his face flushed with alcohol and impotent rage. And Arabella felt momentary fear, old conditioning that made her want to shrink back and hide. But then she felt Sebastian's presence beside her and drew strength from it, reminding herself that her father had no power over her anymore, that she was free. Lord Dashwood pushed past the footman who tried to intercept him and stood swaying in the center of the ballroom, his voice rising above the music and conversation. "Look at her!" he shouted, slurring his words badly enough that several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. "My daughter, sold to a tradesman. £50,000, that is what she cost him. She has bought property, nothing more." The ballroom fell into shocked silence, music stopping mid-phrase, all eyes turning to watch the spectacle. And Arabella felt Sebastian tense beside her, felt his protective instinct surge, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm to still him, because this was her moment, her choice, her chance to finally face down the man who had controlled her entire life through fear. She stepped forward, her emerald silk gown catching the light, and when she spoke her voice was clear and calm, though her hands were shaking. "You are quite right, father," she said, addressing him with a composure that made several guests gasp. Money did change hands, £50,000 to be precise, but it did not purchase me. It purchased my freedom from the nightmare you arranged, from the marriage to Sir Thomas Morland that would have destroyed me the way such marriages have destroyed countless women before me. I chose Mr. Wentworth freely, and I choose him still, every single day." She turned then to address the entire ballroom, framed by windows open to the spring night, and the combination of her beauty and her courage made her seem almost ethereal. "My father sold me once," she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "to a cruel old man who saw me as an object to be used and broken. My husband freed me from that fate, and then offered me something I had never had in my entire life, a choice. I chose love over duty, partnership over obedience, joy over mere survival. If that scandalizes you, I invite you to examine why a woman's autonomy is more shocking than her commodification. I invite you to question why my choice is seen as shameful, while my father's attempt to sell me to the highest bidder is simply accepted as a father's right." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, 4, and then Sebastian's industrial friends began to applaud, slowly at first and then with more enthusiasm, joined hesitantly by some of the more progressive aristocrats, until the ballroom was filled with the sound of approval, while Lord Dashwood stood dishevelled and desperate in the centre of it all, his power gone, reduced to a pathetic figure who had driven himself to public spectacle. Arabella looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the tyrant who had controlled her life, but a diminished man whose cruelty had ultimately cost him everything. "Thank you, Father," she said quietly, though her voice still carried, "for showing me exactly what kind of man to avoid, for being so reprehensible that Sebastian's goodness shone in stark contrast, for teaching me that freedom is worth fighting for, even when that fight terrifies you." The footman moved forward then to escort Lord Dashwood out, and he went without further protest, muttering incoherently about ungrateful daughters and social climbing tradesmen, and his removal was pathetic rather than dramatic, a fallen tyrant diminished by his own venom. The music resumed, conversation gradually returning to normal levels, though now every discussion seemed to centre on Mrs. Wentworth's courage and Lord Dashwood's fall from grace, and Arabella felt Sebastian's hand on her elbow, guiding her onto the dance floor for a waltz. "You were magnificent," he said as they began to move together, his voice rough with emotion. "I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." Arabella rested her head briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of trust and intimacy that made him catch his breath, that spoke of partnership and love more clearly than any words could. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I realized that he could not hurt me anymore. His only power was the fear I gave him, and I chose to take it back." They waltzed in silence for a moment, the ballroom humming with conversation that would reshape London society, with speculation about the Wentworths and their unconventional marriage and their deliberate mixing of classes, and Arabella felt happiness settle in her chest like a warm glow. Then Sebastian spoke again, his voice carrying a note of boyish excitement that made him seem younger. "There is something I want to show you," he said. "An estate in Kent, neglected but full of potential. Extensive grounds that need a vision, gardens that could be extraordinary with the right care. Would you consider making it ours? Designing gardens there. It could be our real home, away from London's performance, a place to build our life together." Arabella pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Gardens?" she repeated. "Truly, my own project." Sebastian smiled, unguarded and warm. "Your own everything," he said. "I thought we might make it our real home. Away from all of this, away from society's expectations, just us building something beautiful, together." Arabella kissed him then, right there in the middle of the ballroom with half of London society watching, and she did not care who saw or what they thought, because she had finally learned that her happiness mattered more than their approval. 6 months later, the Kent estate had become their sanctuary, and Arabella stood in the gardens with her hands dirty from planting, her hair escaping its pins, her face flushed from exertion and joy as she directed the landscapers with confident authority. The grounds were achingly beautiful, wild gardens being slowly tamed into something extraordinary, ancient trees providing shade and structure, and the manor house glowed golden in the afternoon sun behind her. Sebastian watched from the terrace, holding her discarded gloves and bonnet like treasures, his expression one of naked adoration as he observed his wife in her element, creating beauty from neglect, bringing life to spaces that had been forgotten. A footman approached with the afternoon post, and Arabella wiped her hands on her gardening apron before accepting the letters, her face lighting up when she recognized Lydia's handwriting. She opened it immediately, reading aloud to Sebastian as he joined her among the roses. "She is being courted by Mr. Whitmore, the botanist we introduced her to at our ball," Arabella said, her voice catching with emotion. "Listen to what she writes. He asks my opinions and listens to my answers, just like Sebastian does with you. Is this what love feels like, Bella? Not butterflies and poetry, but being truly seen, truly heard, truly valued for who I am rather than what I represent. Oh, Sebastian, she is learning what I learned." Sebastian wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "That love is partnership, not possession," he said quietly. "That the best marriages are built on respect and equality, rather than control. Arabella turned in his arms, dirt-smudged and radiant, more beautiful than she had ever been in any ballroom. "That freedom and love are not opposites," she said. "They are the same thing. When you truly love someone, you want them to be free, to choose their own path, to become the fullest version of themselves. And when you are truly free, you can choose love without fear, without reservation, without wondering if it is real or simply survival dressed up as affection." She looked back at the gardens, at the beauty they were creating together, and thought about that cold March evening when she had stood unnoticed in the doorway of her father's study and witnessed a transaction she did not understand. £50,000, the price of freedom. She had thought it was the cost of her cage, another example of men bartering women like property. But she had been wrong. It was the key that unlocked everything, the beginning of a journey from captivity to choice, from fear to love, from survival to joy. The transaction had not been about purchasing her, but about freeing her, giving her the autonomy to choose her own future, and she had chosen Sebastian, chosen partnership, chosen a life where she could be fully herself, without apology or fear. Lydia's letter rustled in her hand, speaking of courtship and respect and being valued, and Arabella smiled because the freedom Sebastian had purchased for her was rippling outward, creating possibilities for her sister, reshaping what marriage could mean for the next generation. The gardens stretched around them, wild and beautiful and full of potential. And somewhere in London society was still gossiping about the Wentworths and their unconventional ball and the way Mrs. Wentworth had publicly defied her father. But here in Kent none of that mattered. Here there was only growth and love and the quiet satisfaction of building something real together, of choosing each day to stay, not because she must, but because she wanted to, because freedom meant nothing if she could not use it to choose the life that made her happiest. Sebastian kissed the top of her head, holding her close among the roses they had planted together, and Arabella closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of earth and flowers and spring, feeling more alive than she had ever imagined possible, grateful beyond words for the transaction she had witnessed that March evening, for the £50,000 that had seemed like a price but was actually a gift, for the man who had loved her enough to set her free and then waited to see if she would choose to stay. And she would choose him again and again for the rest of her life, freely and joyfully and without reservation, because some cages must be broken, even if the bird fears the open sky. And once freed, once given the choice, that bird might discover that the greatest flight of all is choosing to build a nest with someone who would never dream of clipping her wings.